And we're back.
Okay. I'm just checking on the other one.
Let me quickly step
There we
out.
go.
Just a
Everybody's
second.
jumping in good.
We were just joking about this having to be a part 2.
Yeah. It didn't. My computer wasn't playing well with me, Kyle. It just decided it was done with Native American history and killed me off.
Standard.
It's the natives' revenge.
Yeah, it's really funny. So I started attending the Evergreen State College here in Washington, and I'm in a program, a Native Studies program, and also the assistant to that program. So I get to see all like what's going on behind the scenes for what we're going to be doing coming up. But in our last staff meeting, we were talking with the former, like the interim directors of the program, and counting all of our staff and faculty who was there. There was 8 of us. 5 out of the 8 were non-native, and they were largely in control of the program. And it was really interesting because for being a native program, it was like highly westernized and not really culturally inclusive, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But it's we sit there, we talk about trying to be inclusive when not, and it's like even at a liberal arts college, even some of the programs themselves, like a native centered program, not that native centered.
Unfortunately. Okay.
Yeah, and so thankfully we're changing.
I will start.
Wearing pants. Those are not the podcast rules.
I will start by going onto and join the two together. All right. So next up. Oh, don't forget to mute your microphones, by the way. Next up. Sorry.
Were we finished with mine? Like, did we have to go over that last bit again, or did you get that?
I got all of it. I was just about to like say something, and then it cut me off like right after.
Oh, okay.
So I might have you re-record your actual scripted part, just because the sound was a little bit weird during that. But I'll double check it.
Okay.
Shouldn't be that hard. All right. So next up we have Cassidy, who's flared in the history of Western fashion. She's gonna be talking to us. One of like having non-Reddit-y interests.
Okay, let me just turn my camera off so that me from getting all choppy. Let's see. Okay. Thanks for having me on the 100th episode, Brian, and thanks everybody else for being here too. It's weird to be talking into my mic as part of a group because I'm usually just doing this while recording alone. Everything sound good? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
My name's Cassidy Prococo, and I study the history of fashion, both academically and practically, by which I mean that I read exciting books like Dress Casual, How College Students Redefined American Style, and Fabricating Women, Seamstresses of Old Regime France, which deal with broad concepts and heavier research into primary textual sources. And I also examine and sometimes reproduce antique clothing from the 18th through 20th centuries. And on an everyday basis, I actually wear mostly homemade clothing in 1950s styles. I love answering questions on Ask Historians, and I actually do a lot more of it as a moderator than I ever did as a flair, which I think makes me a bit of an anomaly, because it gives me an opportunity to do research that turns out to be really interesting, but which I might not necessarily have had a need to do. My day job is museum curator / collections manager / visitor services / administrative assistant and everything else. So my research is usually done for the purposes of dating an item that has been donated to the museum or that I've found in an inventory, or for finding out about aspects of local history, for exhibitions, for research questions, and so on. So one of my best answers is actually on the practice of veiling in ancient Greece, something that I had looked a little bit at in college when I wrote a paper on present-day Muslim veiling, but I'd never really gone deep into the history of it. And, in everyday life, I wouldn't have a reason to, but because somebody asked on Ask Historians, I got to find out all about it. However, while I love doing this research, I don't really get many questions to answer. As has been said, my FLAIR area is not that interesting to our user base, which is primarily made up of young men into military and political history. Because of that, I tend to get a lot of questions that are problematic in 3 distinct ways. The first category is questions that the asker doesn't actually seem to care very much about. Sometimes these might be like a shower thought, something kind of random, and I don't always tend to prioritize these as much if there's something else that I need to be doing, because I'm really here to help people who want to learn. And at other times, if it's something I haven't thought much about myself and I don't have a lot going on, I'll dig into them, and sometimes those turn out to be quite interesting. Second category is questions that assume a masculine default when they're asking theoretically about people or about clothing in general. For instance, why are most formal clothes black and white? This is obviously coming from somebody who thinks of formal clothes as tuxedos or business suits, rather than, evening gowns and cocktail dresses, which come in many, many colors. These I do like to answer because I get to point out that they're only thinking about half the population while thinking that they're thinking about everyone. And sometimes they also can take you to an interesting place. The third category is a bit icky because these are questions where the asker and sometimes the people upvoting it, because this category often gets highly upvoted, have a kind of prurient interest or just interest in something gross. And like, how acceptable was it for a young woman to be topless in Anglo-Saxon England? How did Victorian women go to the bathroom in all that clothing? Did women get really sweaty dancing at balls in the 19th century? In one case, I actually got into a little bit of a fight with the poster. I don't know if you guys remember this, because I mentioned as part of my comprehensive answer that their question made me a little uncomfortable, and they were highly offended, probably more offended than I was. It's not my FLAIR area, but I also answer a decent number of questions about women's history in general, particularly about the 18th through mid-20th centuries, the same period of time that I focus on as far as clothing goes. Because as with the fashion questions, these would simply go unanswered if I didn't take them on. And this way, at least a few people can see that questions about women and about clothing are likely to get answered, and they might be encouraged to ask more questions on those subjects later. In the end, it's nearly always rewarding, no matter how gross the question. I'm still getting information out there. I'm learning something myself a lot of the time, or else I'm finding out that something I thought I knew about had more nuances and subtleties, something where there is a standard narrative in fashion history, and I find out that it's more complicated than we thought, and I end up refining my understanding. Sometimes this means that I'll answer essentially the same question 3 times as my knowledge progresses on the subject, which is always interesting. And I'm giving an answer to somebody who might otherwise never find out more about this topic, even if I lose out on the acclaim of answering really popular questions most of the time. Most of the time, I do occasionally have one that hits it big, but not for the most part. Thank you.
We're all sitting here nodding our heads and applauding you right now, for real. Does anybody have any follow-up questions for that one? Joe?
Yeah, so I'm a lot of what you described, for me at least, or in my perception, would fall under this sort of empathy gap I talked about, because like it goes a lot into this direction. Like we talked about this in our group a couple of days ago, where I think Sun mentioned that somebody had asked a question on the sub, like, before the advent of modern medicine, how did women know they were pregnant?
Yes, that one.
And and it seems to me like when you're mentioning that there are these people that ask about basically what's like only half the population, that goes into a similar direction than this empathy gap. Like, is this something that you would generally confirm within your observation, or would you say that there is more involved in that?
No, I think it's pretty similar. There's definitely a lot of these questions, particularly ones that have to do with pregnancy, menstruation. I've had a few of those where it's just like something that the asker had never really thought about before, and suddenly it's like in front of them, and you can just tell that they have completely no idea where this is coming from. They have no idea what the answer could be, and they're just not used to thinking about women as people who have to deal with these things on a regular basis.
Wait, are you telling me women are people?
Women are humans.
Does anybody else have anything they want to say? Go ahead, Kyle.
So similar to how I have a position as an Indigenous person, both on the mod team and on the sub, of course, I would imagine that your perspective that you have as being a woman and being an academic who provides this information to everybody influences not only how you do things, but also how you're perceived. Do you feel like since your time on the subreddit, perhaps with regards to those who are aware of your gender, do they let that, has that been a barrier for you when either providing information or discussing something of an area of expertise for you?
It's actually kind of interesting because unlike a lot of women on Reddit, it doesn't seem to be too much of a problem for me when people realize that I'm a woman. Maybe it's because my area of expertise is like the most stereotypically feminine thing that you can have expertise in, fashion. I actually occasionally get assumed to be a man. Even when I'm answering a question about women's clothing, I'll still have somebody say like, wow, that guy, he knows so much about dresses. It's definitely, there have been occasions, I think, where somebody is responding to my moderation maybe a little bit more huffily because, the girl with the fashion history flair has just told them their answer is not, sufficient. But it's definitely not as bad as I suspect it is for our moderator, Sun Against Gold, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. In part just because my threads don't tend to get as much attention, and so there's just not that that density of Reddit users.
Okay, thank you.
Roll, it's you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask because related to what Kyle is saying about how your topic is in many ways sort of or your gender and your identity obviously affects the way that you're regarded on the internet, but also the topic that you study, because it's well known that most of the questions we get, as Joe was saying, are going to be about World War II, about the Roman Empire, these kind of things. Do you ever get a sense that people think that fashion history perhaps isn't like proper history, that this expertise is just not something that it's worth being good at or worth being interested in, and that you don't really have much to add to this debate? You get a lot of hostility, I guess, because of the specific thing that you do. And if so, like, how do you try to react to that? How do you sort of respond to that constructively?
I feel like I actually get a little bit more of that off Reddit when it's in the like the reenactment community, that there's people people sometimes feel like this is a setting. It's sort of like a fictional setting that people inhabit, and therefore it's not that big of a deal to understand exactly how it works. On Reddit, usually when somebody asks a question in my field, they're just like, this is great. You've answered the question that I had. That's all we needed. And it's not, I don't think there is, I do get, what I do get, and I think it's positive, at least feels positive to me, is people going, wow, I never had any idea that this could be so interesting, that fashion history could be something that I could be interested in, even though I'm a 23-year-old guy who is primarily interested in World War II, and they like it. They've listened to my podcast or they read one of my big answers. So that always feels pretty good, actually.
Okay, I think that's really great. Ro, I think we're going to jump to you next. You might want to kill your video during the whole speech because it seems to doesn't play that well. So up next we have Ippocrates, known as Ro, and he's going to talk to us what it's like being expert in the field where the academic view is very different from the popular view of his field.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. It's been a great experience so far, being both a player and a moderator on Ask Historians, and I guess what I'm about to do is a bit of sort of a love letter to the sub. In many ways, I have this sort of luxury position of being simultaneously an academic who works on a particular field. I mean, I studied Greek warfare, and when I first joined Ask Historians, I had literally just finished my PhD. But working in a field that has a sort of consistent popular interest. People want to know about Greek warfare. People have seen things in movies or read it in books. They played video games that are about this, and they have questions about it. And this is something that really sort of drew me into Ask Historians and made me stay there, is that there is a constant flow of questions about sort of aspects of what I do. And there wasn't at the time another expert who was really sort of covering this. But in particular, because my field is recently, sort of in the last few decades, gone through a massive paradigm shift in the way that we look at this topic, the way that we look at Greek warfare, and the way that we look at things like ancient Sparta has completely changed. And obviously, it takes a long time for these kind of academic insights to make it into public discourse, to make it into pop culture, and to become part of the public consciousness. Instead, what we get, 10 years ago, 300 came out, and this completely redefined and solidified how people look at Sparta in sort of the most old-fashioned and outdated, and by now, in academic terms, completely obsolete way. And so there is still a lot of work to be done there. And one of the fantastic things about Ask Historians is that you get a direct connection between people who have no academic background, who just sort of read popular history, they read books, they learn about stuff in school, they see things in movies. They come to us with questions that are just based on what they picked up in life, what they picked up around them. And then I can just talk to them directly, saying, look, I know a guy who studies this. I've done this myself. I've read these sources. And I can go and tell them how we look at that stuff now, how that's been reinterpreted in recent times. And it's really that direct connection that makes it incredibly worthwhile for me to be on Ask Historians, and for somebody who works on something, on a field that's really changing right now, to be on Ask Historians, because specifically, you get to tell people, look, that's not how we look at this anymore. You get to be the conduit through which that change happens, through which that modern, updated academic view gets communicated to the general audience, to people who are interested in it. And they are interested, they love it, they want to know. I very rarely, and this really has struck me, and I'm really so happy about it, I rarely get pushback. I rarely get people on Ask Historians telling me, no, I just don't believe you. I just don't think that you're right with this revisionist bullshit. Like, people will say, oh, actually, that's really interesting. I hadn't realized that. People will say, oh, if that's how we look at it, like, what kind of material is there? Where can I read more about this? Like, they really want to have that cutting edge. They really are interested in that. And, that makes it an incredibly rewarding experience. And this is why, for me, it's been for several years, it's been a continuous affirmation that what I do matters to people. They want to know about it. They have found out about it. They're very, very happy to learn that. And that's what makes Ask Historians such a fantastic thing to contribute to.
Good. Does anybody have any follow-up questions they want to add on to that? Go ahead, Joe.
I have to say, I think it's absolutely great that you really experience what I think is one of the best aspects of our whole endeavor, in that you have the feeling I can really go out and present what is new and what is exciting about all of this to an audience that really cares and will take that in and will appreciate that, because I also deal with a fairly popular topic on the sub, which is the Holocaust and World War II, and what Hitler thought about a wide variety of things. And frankly, I on the other hand have experienced pushback, which is like people hated my post about Ramo, and then we also fairly frequently get all these Holocaust deniers, which is really something that is still strange to me, coming from a culture in the country where, you know, that shit is outlawed and will get you in jail eventually. So I think I'm really happy. It's more of a comment, but I'm really happy that I this is maybe confined to some very specific topics that people feel very strongly about, and is not an experience that, you know, our resident Spartan and Greek warfare expert and hopefully many others do not have. So I think that's more my comment on this whole matter.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I realize I'm in a bit of a privileged position where my field, I mean, there are a few people who are sort of really invested in having a particular view on this. Although when I did the same thing for a YouTube channel, we did get a lot of pushback from YouTube commenters. So I do feel that it is to some extent to do with the fact that people who come to Ask Historians, they really do want to know. And they want to get the cutting edge. They don't just want to sort of have their beliefs, their existing beliefs reconfirmed. So to some extent, of course, you will get, you know, and especially in other fields, I won't dare to comment on the experience of other people. You will get more of a sense of like what you're saying is not what I want to hear. It is something that I think sort of sets Ask Historians apart, specifically because it develops this reputation of being the place where you go to get more depth, where you go to get the actual cutting edge, where you go to get the scholarly perspective, rather than just to hear about something, you know, that you're happy to be very vaguely curious about. And in that sense, I think, you know, it does sort of pre-select a little bit towards people who may well be interested in hearing, you know, the cutting edge. And to some extent, you know, we always have to be aware that there's this Reddit culture of wanting to be smug about having the latest point of view and you know, wanting to have the sort of the edge when you're having a conversation with a friend or something like that. But generally speaking, I think it's good natured. I think it's genuinely just because people they come to Ask Historians because they want to know the sort of the most in-depth, most up-to-date analysis.
Okay, I think that's really great. I'm going to jump over to you, Hunter, next, if you're ready.
I'm good to go.
Okay. So finally, to kind of draw us towards a sort of conclusion, and I suppose one of the critiques of humanities in general is that there's not enough hard numbers. We have Georgi K. Zukov here to give us the hard numbers of the subreddit, to show how the work we're doing is improving and how the subreddit is developing as a whole.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I am Georgi Zukov, and I am here to talk about the work that we do kind of behind the scenes to maintain how the community is functioning and to monitor the health of the community. With Ask Historians, we like to consider ourselves something of a unique community in that Reddit world. And part of this is that we look to our community to be different. People have already talked about the rules regarding civility and how that came about to try and set us apart. And in looking at ourselves as a unique community, we try to watch the health of the subreddit and ensure that we are not letting it down on our end. A project that I've taken on in the past year to do this is checking periodically to see how we're performing. How often does someone come here and get an answer? How often does someone come here and not get an answer? Because if we're failing to provide a space where people want to be answering questions, it means that we're not providing the space that we want to get out of here. I'm taking these headphones off. It feels echoing in my head there. Okay. Back to where I was talking. Okay, so in monitoring the health of the community, something that I do every month is check to see how the top 50 threads in the subreddit for the past month performed. That is to say, I boot up the search. You can search by time, and I look the past month, and I see what got answered, what didn't get answered, how long is it taking an answer to come in. If we are doing well, generally speaking, we see roughly a 95% answer rate these days for the top 50 questions. Those questions represent pretty much any question that hits the top of the subreddit. Those average to be at the top for 14 hours to 20 hours, depending on how popular it is. And that is what most people come to the subreddit see. We really care a lot that those questions get answered, because that is the face of the subreddit. That's what new people coming in are going to see. And we want to ensure that if you're coming here, you are getting content and seeing that great content is produced here every day. But I don't only look at those top 50, because even though those represent the most popular questions, as has come up already in other people's discussions here, the top question of the day is not necessarily the most interesting question of the day. And oftentimes you'll see a question which is absolutely fascinating, but it's only really of interest to the person asking it, the person answering it, and maybe 10, 15 people who upvoted it. We really want to make sure that those also are getting answered, though, because that is the real guts of this community, that people can come here and ask strange, esoteric questions that they put a lot of thought into, and someone will come and put the effort into answering it, even though they're not getting the accolades that someone answering a thread with 10,000 upvotes is going to be getting. And for this, I have a similar methodology, but I look at a lot more than just 50 threads. I will open up every single question asked for 7 semi-randomly chosen days of the month. I try to have a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, et cetera, without overlapping of weeks. And I also throw out major holidays. So this month, I'm not going to be counting Thanksgiving the day after Thanksgiving or the day before Thanksgiving, simply because the expectation is that a lot of the American audience will not be around. So it probably would influence the rate. Anyways, though, so I open up all those threads, which comes roughly to 800 to 900 threads per month. And I will go through every single one and check to see whether there's an answer, whether there's not an answer. I look at that and I come up with a percentage of how many questions are getting answered every single month. And we use that to monitor how we're doing. Generally speaking, if you come in and you ask a question, all other factors being the same, it has about a 40% chance of getting answered, which on the one hand, you might say, okay, but 60% of questions are not getting answered. And yes, that is a downside, don't get me wrong. But on the other hand, that means that there are people willing to step up and answer about 50 or so questions every single day for strangers on the internet, simply to enjoy the good feeling that you get from a couple upvotes being thrown your way. And additionally, if you look at Reddit as a whole, a lot of threads don't get attention. I also count not just the rate that a question is answered, I also look at how many threads are ignored. And also I have what I call the insufficient rate, which is the number of questions where someone tried to answer it, but we removed any answers that were in that thread. The average insufficient rate comes to about 15%, and the average ignored rate comes to about 45%. And then, sorry, I have a bit of a cough there. So when you add all this together, what you're actually looking at is only 15% of threads, 15% of threads are seeing someone try to answer it, and that gets removed. And if you look at Reddit as a whole, this actually lines up very closely with how Reddit generally functions. Almost 50% of submissions on major subreddits get ignored entirely. So we're only removing a fairly small amount of content that doesn't fit. And what this tells us is that for the most part, our rules are working. We have a difference compared to the rest of Reddit of only 10 to 15% in how people are responding to threads. And it means for us that we're happy with how things are doing. What do we do to improve, though? Sometimes we'll see a month where there's a drop. To look at, let me just call up my spreadsheet here. To look at how we've been doing the past couple months, we had the summer, we were doing really well. We had a 44% answer rate, 42%, a 41%. But then last month, October, we dropped down to 35%. We look back and we try to see what is happening in that month that might have caused things to go down. Were questions, was it just a matter of a lot of questions seeming to be less interesting? Was it flares being less active? Or were we changing how we were moderating consciously or unconsciously? Because something that we really look to ensure is that we are moderating to an objective standard so anyone who comes into the subreddit knows what they can expect on our end. We don't want to be removing something one day from someone and then the next day someone posts something that's almost identical and another mod comes along and they approve that, or vice versa. We want to make sure there's a consistency in moderation, and when there is a significant change in those rates, it means that we need to evaluate to make sure that we are maintaining that same quality that everyone expects from us. Something else that we do, though, and what this helps to inform us, as well as the periodic surveys that we take, is we really try to ensure that the flared community is happy with how the subreddit is going. To be sure, the subreddit is more than just its flares, it's more than just its mods. We depend heavily on just the regular users, the lurkers who come in and just upvote questions or upvote answers, people who ask questions because they don't know, and the users who they might not be experts on a topic enough to feel that they deserve flare, but they do know a lot about one very specific thing, and there's a question in that specific field that they can answer very well. But nevertheless, the flared community, which numbers between 300 and 400 users, is the core component, and we really do rely on them to ensure that the subreddit keeps working and keeps producing answers at the rate that we want to see. So ensuring that the flared community is happy and that the flared community is on board with the vision that we have is really important to us. And we reach out to them, we try to work with them to do any, if we're changing the rules, we usually will reach out to them, we'll talk to them and see, hey, is this working well? Is this not working well? What do you think about it? And we use that to inform our decisions, because if the subreddit is not operating how they want to see it operate, they might not be coming back. And likewise, we try to encourage them to participate more. Behind the scenes, a lot of the mods, if we see a question that we're like, we see that question and we know that it's a great question, we know that there's a specific flare who would really, really do a great job answering it, we'll reach out to them. We'll say, hey, this question popped up, it's in your field, we think it's really interesting. Don't feel any obligation, but if you have time, you should answer it. And we get a lot of positive feedback on that. And the flares feel that it helps to promote the community feeling that we want to see out of this subreddit. Moving forwards, for something that I really want to look to in the future, and I've been working on, although it's a little more complicated, is looking not just at the performance of the subreddit itself, but also what topics drive Ask Historians, and how can we better serve users in specific subfields that they're asking questions. We just off the cuff, we know, for instance, that we get a lot of questions about World War II. It's very popular. They never stop coming in. We also know that we can cover World War II fairly well. We have a lot of flares who are in that field. But then the flip side is Southeast Asian history, for instance. It's not the most popular topic to come in, but when questions do, we know that we have a very poor performance rate with Southeast Asia because we have very few flared users who cover that topic. This is something that, looking to the future, we want to try to find ways to better address. How can we identify the underserved topic fields of history, and how can we improve our performance there. So the next project that I'm working on, and I hope to be able to roll it out in the not too distant future, is a breakdown of not just how the subreddit is performing, but what topics perform best, what topics perform worst, and where can we improve in that field. So hopefully something will come of it, but we'll see. Okay.
Anybody have any follow-ups for that one? Joe?
So I don't know if one of my distinct impressions has always been that in terms of and I don't think users really know this, but you mentioned we're not that different from Reddit as a whole, and I think what most users don't realize is we have this about daily threat that hits all because it gets a lot of upvotes, and that's where the most of the work comes in terms of removing comments.
Oh, absolutely. I would say 90% of our removals come from whatever threads on top of the subreddit.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because it's always these people coming in from all and saying, well, I never see any answers in this subreddit, and there is never anything, it's all just removed, and really it's just the selective reality of only seeing these threads where exactly because the people come from all, we have to remove so much.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I won't lie, the reason I started this project in the first place, it was entirely off the cuff. It was a boring afternoon, I had nothing better to do, and someone was like, hey, I never see anything answered. And I was like, you know what, I want to see whether that's true. So I called up the threads from the past month, and I went through, see how many were answered, and I was like, oh, hey, 95% of these were answered that in the past month. What the heck are you complaining about, man? And what it comes down to is that a lot of users, especially if you're a first-time user or if you only come in once a month, you only come in because a thread is hit all. And what a lot of users forget is that someone's upvoting a question because they like the question, not because they like the answer. I mean, yes, once there is an answer, people will hopefully be upvoting the question because they think there's a great answer in there, but it is not a direct correlation. And you come in, especially if a question's only been up for 3-4 hours, you shouldn't be expecting an answer. I just wrote something today, and I think I spent 2 hours just reading background before I even started writing, because I knew the general gist of what I was writing about, but I still needed to make sure I had specifics. I needed to find some good quotations. I need to find some good numbers. These answers just don't come out of the blue. And what a lot of users who are used to Reddit and the instant gratification of coming in and seeing let's be charitable, seeing a good discussion going on, they come in and it's the proverbial comment graveyard. And I understand if you've not been to Ask Historians before, it can be frustrating. And I don't want to come off as harsh, but we don't cater to that user base. We cater to the users who come in and they are willing to be patient, and they're willing to check back in 3-4 hours and say, oh, wow, it got answered, and wow, it was really worth the wait. And it's a downside of Reddit that there aren't that many ways to encourage this. We use the top level warnings. We encourage people to use the Remind Me bot. We encourage people to use the RES subscription feature, but there really just isn't good native ways in Reddit to come back and check a thread in 6 hours, in 10 hours, in the time that it takes someone to put the effort into writing that answer. So
I do have one more thing, and I think what also, when we're talking about the plans to keep tabs on which topics are performing well, I think that is tied closely to the Flare community being the core of it all, because we sometimes see that some topics are done extremely well because we have one person who does a lot of the heavy lifting. Cassidy is such an example. From what fashion questions we have, she answers a lot, and Stefan also does a lot of this thing. Rule. sun is one of the most prolific answers. And in terms of the most popular topic, like World War II and the Nazis, like I don't know where we would be without Kieslowski fan.
Or you.
Well,
don't sell yourself short.
No, but I mean, like I think he's like our Kieslowski fan. They are one of the most prolific examples because they do so many questions every day virtually. So I think this is also really goes to show that those topics that perform well also perform well because there are some people who really invest a lot of time into
Oh, absolutely. There is definitely a feedback loop that we notice. And if we have good flares in a field, it just encourages more questions in that field. And when we don't have good flares, it means less questions. And then there's less questions, we get less flares coming in on that topic again. So it does absolutely just feed into itself. And when you don't get many questions about Southeast Asia, as we already mentioned, you don't get many questions about Oceania. You don't get many flares because they just don't have the opportunity. And we try to find ways to encourage people to come in and write about things that might not be popular. So we have the Monday Methods is a great way to highlight just talking about history for the historiography and doing history itself. We have the Thursday thread where someone can come in and just talk about theory. We have Saturday where you can come in and just write a book review. And we try to encourage it, but people don't take enough advantage of it, we feel. And we definitely working on ways to promote Ask Historians to those flares who are in, or potential flares, I should say, in fields that don't get coverage is another thing that we are always looking into and always trying to improve on, but we definitely aren't there yet.
Does anybody have anything else they want to add in before I close it out? Go ahead, Kyle.
So it's really interesting because you mentioned too while you were speaking that people care about numbers, and
Yes. I love numbers.
Yeah, and in my opinion, coming from a culture where the qualitative is usually valued a little bit more than the quantitative, I always find it very interesting how obsessed people really get about numbers and statistics, and that these are the end all be all. Like, this is what proves and validates things. What is your rebuttal to the people who either effectively say that, or at least come off with that kind of an attitude where, unless we're, like you mentioned, the 40 and 60%, how come we're not at that 60%, we're at the 40%? That must mean you have a poor quality subreddit. What is your rebuttal to their issue with not meeting their statistical boundary, or whatever they want to call it?
Well, I mean, as I already said, if you look at Reddit as a whole, I don't have the thread handy. I did call it up, but I know that there's been studies on the performance of Reddit as a whole. And if you post to one of the most popular subreddits, I believe that they did it using the 50 defaults. 50% of threads get 0 comments. 50%. So the difference between us and a default is 10%. And that's even factoring removals. So if the difference between getting an answer in our subreddit and getting an answer in, let's say, our history, which was a default until they ended the whole defaults thing, if the difference is 10%, as far as I'm concerned, that 10% difference is worth the difference in quality that you get if you come to somewhere like Ask Historians and you're getting an answer that is curated to a certain degree based on the rules that we have in place. And history, which, as a moderator of history, I'm not going to be too down on it, but in history, where you can get an answer that might be decent, might not, there's a very wide degree that you get there that you don't get in Ask Historian. So I think, in my opinion, that that 10%, that is the price you pay in looking for the quality of Ask Historians. And the people who come to Ask Historians to ask their question, they agree that that price is worth it. Because Reddit, as we like to say to some of our less happy customers, Reddit is a site that has communities for everything. You can go to Ask Historians to ask a question, but if you don't want the answer that Ask Historians provides, you can go to our history. You can go to our Ask History. You can go to Explain Like I'm 5. There's a ton of great communities on Reddit to cater to everything that you might want in terms of an answer. You can go to Explain Like I Am A, and you can have someone answer your historical question as if they're, I don't know, a transformer. There is literally everything out there. And if you're coming to Ask Historians, it's because you want a historian to answer your question. And if you don't want an historian to answer your question, you should be using those other communities, which we want to endorse. We don't want users coming to Ask Historians because they think it's the only option. We want them coming because they think it is the option best suited for them. And we try to encourage people to go to history, try to encourage people to go to Explain Like I'm 5, encourage people to go to Ask History, because if that's the answer that they want, that's where they should go, and we want them to get that answer. But we're not going to change the rules of our subreddit simply to cater to people who think that it should be no different than those subreddits.
Does anybody have any final thoughts of the whole thing before I close it out? Nope. Okay. Thank you guys all so much for coming here today and doing this panel. But I know, as with any meta thread, we will have a bunch of follow-up questions. So feel free to join us in Ask Historians for our follow-up thread, and you can ask all of our panelists or any of our panelists any specific questions you might have. And with that said, thank you all for joining me here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting this, Brian.
Thank you.
All right,
Thanks, Brian.
and cut. We are good. Thanks, guys. We did it. We only went an hour over time.
All right, let me stop my audacity.
Like we did a little mini rundown of the NCPH last year. Or was this year?
This year.